for choreography. There we go. Anthony in his studio also produced a very useful kind of paper, very simple paper, which included 12, sometimes 15 iterations of the 36-point grid. And parallel to his own process of drawing, I began to also produce choreographic drawings in order to coincide with his temporal structure. So what you see here, the A's, the C's, and T's refer to people. Adam, Cece, Tal, and Sarah are the performers. And this for me is an example of how Anthony's process of creating a work, a visual work and a temporal work, as well as the choreography and time structure I've been working with, have really met and in a sense braided together along similar and agreed upon propositions for the piece. And in a way, in terms of etymology, the word choreography, when you boil it down, in Greek it's circle writing. So there's a very graphic and it often connotes drawing, which even some of the solid light films that we saw earlier, I think, speak very strongly to drawing and sometimes are described as such. I also would like to leave time for a few questions and also creative exchange. So I'd like to thank you for your time, and it's really a pleasure to be back.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Jonah. There are about 100 questions I'd like to ask, but I'm going to constrain myself and open the floor to start. I think there's a mic here, and the floor is open. Please don't hesitate. Any questions? Just raise your hands here.
I once wrote and directed a student production that was inspired by Antonin Artaud and Kabuki, and also incorporated metaphysical theater. So I was really interested in everything you were saying, but I wanted to know if there were any theater practitioners that you were particularly inspired by or admired.
Did you say Artaud?
Yeah,
Anthony
and Kabuki.
And you mentioned Kabuki as well. Okay. I've read many of Artaud's texts and have seen two Kabuki productions and have admiration for both practices. One theater artist that has impacted some of my visual thinking is a theater artist named Robert Wilson. And he in the late 60s and early 1970s did a series of durational theatrical events, sometimes between 2 and 48 hours, that tested the physical limits of the performer and the viewer. But he trained as an architect and always starts with what he calls scenography for designing a work. So that theater artist, Robert Wilson, I think impacted my thinking about, we could say, scenography for that.
Question here?
I'll just speak.
Actually, it's better if you speak so that sure everyone can hear.
So we've been talking a lot about power relationships and our relationships to authority. So I wanted to ask, between the two of you, is there somebody who is there one person that seems to have the reigning authority, one person constraining the other person more, or, basically what is the relationship like when it comes to working in a space together?
Well, I think what's very, for me, has been very interesting about this process is that there wasn't one. in the sense that once we'd met and talked about doing something, it wasn't a question of meeting once a week and then hashing out ideas. Not at all. It was actually, Jonah, I think, hoped that I would come back with something that he would then respond to. And it's been a surprise to me, in some ways, actually, how little we've had to discuss. We did, when I first came up with the idea of the grid, as opposed to this, I think, as I said, the idea that we would work with some kind of solid life forms, I did introduce the idea of the grid to him, and he liked it and immediately began playing with it in the studio, throwing together a very rough grid of light bulbs and trying it out. Apart from that, I don't think we had a single conversation until I was finished. And I think this is, I suspect this is extremely unusual, and rather exemplary because, you know, of course there are those close collaborations where everything's discussed and agreed on. But you know, you pay a price for that, which is you have to leave a lot of stuff outside the door. You have to agree to work with the things that you can both agree about. And what's quite interesting about this is that it can be something of a challenge. I mean, there have certainly been ideas in my structure, one element or another that Jonah has wanted to talk through, and we have. But in fact, what I produced has survived pretty much intact. But what's amazing now is that Jonah's work on it has completely fused it with his, and producing something that, of course, neither of us could have done alone.
I think about the, you know, we were speaking earlier about the Brooklyn Academy of Music being a very powerful institution, and it is it's celebrating its 150th year this year. So it's for the performing arts. But it also has very powerful programming, and I think about its powerful programming being a very positive word. In terms of power dynamics, as you mentioned, I don't see that playing out in this collaboration so much. I think that the invitation to Anthony, I was conscious that I wanted to create a very large space for his work. And actually, we've used the word scaffolding or armature a few times. And I was conscious that I would say I was ready for a structure that he would propose. And really, with choreography, sometimes there just are enough problems on their own. For example, scheduling and really the practicalities of overseeing and supporting dancers and their needs. So for me, it was a pleasure to see, actually to enter Anthony's work a bit more deeply and understand how he comes up with these structures.
I would add a word to that. With having just seen the rehearsal on Sunday night, I was struck by how strongly, and being familiar with both of their works to a certain degree, how strongly it felt both like a work of Anthony's and like a work of Jonah's. And also that, and as Anthony described, the light bulbs are hanging throughout the space, so the dancers are moving and in between these hanging bulbs. And I was also struck by how much it seemed very much like a conversation between Jonah's work and the dancer's work and Anthony's, and not an argument, actually, but a conversation. It could have been that too, and that might have been interesting, but it felt like a conversation.
And I see this also being quite a challenge. I mean, as I said, my whole structure is an armature for Jonah's choreography. But the truth is that the structure is itself choreographed, and so you have two levels of choreography interacting with one another, which I can only imagine has increased the complexity from his point of view.
There's a question back there.
How important would you say? How important would you say mathematics is to what you do, or how much do you have to know about math in order to do what you do?
Is that for both of them?
More directed at Anthony, but for both of you, yes.
You know, I do a lot of counting, because I do. Actually, the first time Jonah and I made friends was in his studio. I arrived to see a rehearsal and turned up with a very large stopwatch and demanded to know how long it took to do, to walk slowly, to walk fast, or to walk in between. Everyone was gravely walking up and down to me, clocking. And in fact, what time-based work all has in common is about counting. And I think it's the overlapping language of what we've both done, in fact. As far as the math is concerned, I'm not very good at balancing a checkbook or doing complex equations. I can't do complex equations. But I found that I can think mathematically, and I sometimes work with a mathematician when the equations for producing something, the algorithms are needed in the scripting of my work, are too complex for the programmer. I have a colleague, Philip Warding, who's a mathematician, who works with me sometimes, and I only admire the elegance of what arrives back, but I can't really read it at all. Except that it does what I want. And for some reason, my mind works in a way that is like a mathematician's, but I can't articulate it. I should add